Welcome back, everyone, to the fifth and final part of our discussion of the Irish Potato Famine using Extra History's fantastic series on that subject. If you have not seen the first 4 episodes, there's a link in the description below, as well as the link to the original content if you want to watch it without my commentary. We're going to go ahead and dive right into this one. We do have some streams coming up this weekend that I'll be posting about very soon. So if you turn on your notifications after you make sure you're subscribed, you'll get those notifications when I post about the scheduled time for both streams. There's going to be a public stream and also a stream just for members and patrons. Those will both be in the next 2 or 3 days. All right, here we go.
Dublin, August 5th, 1847.
My birthday.
The city awakens to the toll of cathedral bells. Dublineers from every level of society, from shoeless boys to princes of the church, course through the streets.
And when he says princes of the church, that means cardinals. For those who are not Catholic like myself, I'm not Catholic, cardinals are considered to be princes of the church, and that was a cardinal they showed there in the front.
Walking toward St. Mary's. Men sent as representatives from the furthest towns of Ireland pat their pockets, ensuring they have matches to light a votive candle. They're all going to see a man buried. And not just any man. 3 days before, in a year when so many had died without coffins, thousands of people had watched one be carried through the streets. Inside was the liberator, Daniel O'Connell. Dublineers wept for the man who'd fought for their religious freedom, the first Irish Catholic to sit in Parliament, and the man who had come closer than anyone to repealing the Act of Union tying Ireland to Great Britain. A crusader who had denounced anti-Semitism and slavery. And a man who in death had their forgiveness.
So slavery by this point is outlawed in the British Empire. The slave trade was outlawed in the first decade of the 19th century. And then it was in the early 1830s when they outlaw slavery in general. And much of that is thanks to the work of a man named William Wilberforce, who himself was inspired by a man named John Newton. There's a fantastic story there. And I highly recommend you watch the movie Amazing Grace, which is one of the first roles, at least the first one I can remember seeing Benedict Cumberbatch in. He plays William Pitt the Younger, who was Prime Minister at the age of 24. Anyway, William Wilberforce, one of his mentors was a man who was his pastor for a time, John Newton. John Newton, in his earlier life, had been on a slave ship. He had been, I think, even captain of his own slave ship. And by his own admission, transported something like 20,000 Africans into slavery from Africa. John Newton became a committed Christian after encountering some, I think, Moravian missionaries, and gave up that life and dealt with a lot of regret over that later in life. And among other things, he wrote a poem called Faith's Review and Expectation, which was basically a poem that was telling his story. Well, somebody picked up that poem and put it to music. The words that John Newton wrote about his life in this poem, Faith's Review and Expectation, were Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I am found, was blind, but now I see. It became the song Amazing Grace, and that's why the movie's called Amazing Grace. But he inspired William Wilberforce, among other people who inspired him, and Wilberforce made it his lifelong mission to eliminate slavery. And right after they eliminated the slave trade, John Newton died, and within, I think, a few days of the elimination of slavery in the British Empire, William Wilberforce died. It was like he had completed his mission and he could go now. Anyway, long tangent that has nothing to do with the Irish Potato Famine, but when I heard them talk about the crusade against slavery, I thought I'd throw that one in there for you for free.
For in their greatest hour of need, he had failed them. In 1847, the British government caved on its policy of trying to morally reform Ireland via food aid. The Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, recognized the failure of Trevelyan's aid program and turned to directly feeding 3 million in Ireland via soup kitchens and workhouses.
So somebody commented the other day and mentioned, and I hadn't picked up on this right away, that the name Trevelyan happens to be the name of the villain played by Sean Bean in Goldeneye. And, of course, Pierce Brosnan is James Bond in that movie, and Pierce Brosnan's Irish. He's the first Irish James Bond. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. I don't think that's where the name comes from, because there was actually another man named Trevelyan who they think that's who was inspired that name.
Private charities joined in, with Irish Quakers trying to fill the gap. Donations to the British Relief Association came from as far away as India, Mexico, and Venezuela. Queen Victoria sent public letters asking the British to donate to relief organizations and contributed £2,000. And large donations came from Pope Pius IX and the Sultan of Turkey, who had also sent ships full of supplies.
So somebody mentioned in the comments a few videos back, and I don't know if he'll mention it here or not, that I think it might have been that Sultan that tried to give more, but there was some kind of policy in place that nobody could give more to the relief effort than Queen Victoria, and so it was rejected, which is ridiculous, but it shows you how much kind of politics and playing with people's lives was going on here.
It was not enough, but it did save many lives. The 1847 harvest was a healthy one, with no signs of blight, yet it was only a quarter the size of a normal harvest. Desperate farmers had eaten their seed potatoes in 1846, leaving few to plant for next year's crop. So though free of blight, Ireland still needed aid.
So seed potatoes, because if you've seen the movie The Martian, which I talked about a while ago, potatoes themselves can be planted and turned into more potatoes. But that means you have to hold back some of what you harvested for planting the next year.
But British relief started to run into popular opposition. Homeless Irish refugees were increasingly showing up in British cities, stranded while trying to make it to a port. And a bubble in railroad construction had recently burst, sending Britain into recession. And suddenly, a public who viewed Ireland with deep prejudice, but some sympathy, began to sour. The British press portrayed the Irish as freeloaders. Aid was scaled back and began to disappear. And as that happened, an 1847 poor law meant to encourage landowners to act responsibly backfired. The law charged a tax on landowners that rose along with the rate of poverty among their tenants. To keep their taxes down, it was thought, the landowners would ensure that their tenants weren't living in poverty. Instead, you would be shocked to learn the landowners found a loophole.
So the 1847 Poor Law Extension Act, enacted in June 1847, it says it empowered boards of guardians to relieve all those classed as destitute without necessarily obliging them to become inmates of a workhouse. So it was meant to kind of help out, and you can see here a map of Ireland. And so I mentioned a few episodes back about these union workhouses, which my great-great-great-grandmother died in the Dudley Union Workhouse outside of Birmingham in England. And so these are the new poor law unions that are formed. These are these groups that are formed to try and help take care of those in need. The original 130 poor law unions covered more extensive areas than their English equivalents. And so you can see a lot of it down here. These were all unchanged in Northern Ireland. That's where you have the primarily Protestant Scots-Irish or Ulster-Irish in the north. This is where most of the problem is happening with the famine. And according to this, it sanctioned outdoor relief in the form of meager rations for the able-bodied poor, but only on a short-term basis and when the workhouses were full. It's now available. So they made it available to more people than had previously been the case. But it looks like it was abandoned in August. And according to this, there's a lot here and I won't get too far into it, but according to this, Sir John Russell's policy in Ireland, exemplified by the poor law extension, led to over 1 million excess deaths. 1 million people that are believed to have died as a direct result of the policies of the government. That's hard to get past.
Mass evictions. They didn't have a poor rate after all, if they didn't have tenants. With the economy collapsing, and many tenants too weak to work, landowners had ample excuse to bring in the constables with their sledgehammers and torches, running families out of their homes.
So basically what he's saying is that you were responsible for your tenants. So it backfires because what do? If you don't want to have to take care of your tenants, well, you just don't have tenants anymore, so you evict everybody. Not my problem, they're not my tenants. Ridiculous, but you would think that's something they would have thought of.
By bringing the walls down around them, whole towns turned out on the road, took to living in ditches or flooding into cities to fill workhouses and beg on the streets. But this incredible cruelty triggered repercussions. The midnight legislators, militias like the Molly Maguires, ambushed landlords, police, and even clergy on the road. 4 Irish landowners were assassinated that year. And in addition, the Poor Law had another disturbing component. To ensure that only the poorest could claim for relief, only those with less than a quarter acre of farmland could receive food aid. Therefore, many small farms...
So people who have more than a quarter acre, who still don't have any crops, who still don't have any food, aren't eligible. All these loopholes, just ridiculous. But again, it's easy to look at this and think, man, you can't murder people. And I agree, you shouldn't murder people, but put yourself in their position. This is going on, 2 years now. They've just come through the worst of it. People are dying. If your family is starving and you're dying and you've been evicted by the person who's supposed to be helping you, there's a lot of anger there. And it may not be excusable, but it's understandable.
Farmers had to give up all they had to survive. Ireland needed a champion, an advocate. Yet despite their great need, Irish political leaders were largely absent from the crisis. Daniel O'Connell, who had ran the Repeal Association, Ireland's largest political bloc, had been outspoken at first. But in 1845 and 1846, he'd failed to recognize the scale of the disaster. Potato failures and food scarcity were nothing new to Ireland, and he believed it would go away. His focus remained on deposing Prime Minister Peel. O'Connell saw him as pro-Protestant, anti-Catholic, and anti-Irish. Therefore, O'Connell led the Irish parliamentary bloc in ousting Peel and served as the kingmakers in bringing the Liberal Whigs to power. O'Connell was playing the long game. He saw the Whigs as willing to compromise on Ireland, and in helping them form a government, he hoped to extract promises to win the Irish greater freedom. So, he stayed quiet, only speaking up in private as the starvation deepened. He tried to parlay this Whig alliance into something useful, even voting for harsh crime bills that increased colonist pressure on Ireland. By the time he realized that he'd been played, it was too late. Members of his Repeal Association were up in arms over his...
So he was trying to play everybody else and in the process got played himself. And that's the risk that you run with compromise, is that you think you're giving up something, but you don't realize what the other side's giving up. There's this famous compromise that happens in the early part of the American government. It's called the Dinner Table Compromise, and it's this meeting that was popularized in the musical Hamilton between Alexander Hamilton, I think Thomas Jefferson, and I want to say James Madison. And basically, Hamilton, who is the Secretary of the Treasury and basically the most powerful person in the government, he's kind of a de facto prime minister for George Washington. Washington lets him run everything. And Jefferson hates him, but they compromise on this issue because there's something that they both want. But they think they both get what they want, but really Hamilton wins out. What Jefferson wants, and what a lot of the Southern members of Congress want, is for the new capital that they're talking about building to be in the South. And so they end up building it on the Potomac River, taking part of the capital from land from Maryland and part from Virginia. The Virginia part was eventually given back many years later, but and that was what the Virginians wanted, and they got that. What Hamilton wanted was for the United States government to assume the war debt of all the states, which would give the government tremendous power, especially financial power, which was what Hamilton wanted. And they both think they're compromising, and they both think they're giving something up. But in the end, Hamilton didn't really give up anything that was important to him, and he got exactly what he wanted. I think that's what kind of happened here, is he compromised, but he lost.
Support of the Whigs and splitting into factions. On one side were the Old Irelanders. They followed O'Connell's principles of nonviolence. On the other, the Young Irelanders. While they didn't advocate rebellion, they believed taking it off the table was a strategic mistake. To force concessions out of London, they argued, they had to at least preserve the threat of taking up the gun. So in 1846, O'Connell had finally had enough. Anxious to consolidate his hold over the movement, He forced a crisis in the Repeal Association by calling a vote. To remain part of the association, all members must pledge to forswear violence. The Young Irelanders walked out, splitting Ireland's largest political organization. Over the coming year, Old and Young Ireland were at each other's throats. One Old Irelander, totally adhering to his non-violent roots, set his dogs on a political opponent, and Old Irelanders interrupted Young Ireland meetings, in one instance smashing in the doors with a battering ram. Ireland was experiencing its greatest existential crisis of the 19th century, and its most powerful political organization was wasting its focus on an internecine feud. The results proved tragic for Young Ireland. Unfettered from the moderates in the Repeal Association, they increasingly talked of rebellion. And to their surprise, the wheels of rebellion started to turn faster than they'd thought. An uprising, unthinkable in 1847, started to seem inevitable. Scarcity and political disaffection across Europe boiled over in 1848.
And of course, we know it didn't result in Irish independence, at least not at that time. But a few generations later, it will come. And, you can see how the seeds of what happened during the Great War and, the second decade of the 20th century were happening even then. Certainly much earlier than this, but this is where you have, and then probably the great-grandchildren of these people are the ones who finally get independence for Ireland.
Kicking off a series of bloodless revolutions. The French overthrew their king, Denmark ended in absolute monarchy, Austria abolished serfdom, and the Netherlands instituted democracy. Demonstrations surged through the streets of a dozen major cities, and a heady feeling swept through the Young Irelanders. Might it be possible? They traveled to Paris to view the new government, and brought back a new flag. A tricolor, like the French one, but with Catholic green and Protestant orange, united by a white field of truce. And things started to happen. When a prominent Young Ireland leader got arrested, a mob broke into jail to save him. Armed men flocked to their cause, and it seemed, for a moment, that the whole nation might rise and throw off the British yoke. But the Young Irelanders had no plan, and the British absolutely did. Soldiers and police scooped up the leaders, imprisoning or transporting them to faraway prison colonies. In fact, the only confrontation was a skirmish so minor, it was known as the Battle of Mrs. McCormick's Cabbage Patch.
That's fantastic. The Battle of Mrs. McCormick's Cabbage Patch. Oh, fantastic. I got to hear what happens here.
The Young Irelander rebellion failed.
Oh, we don't get to find out. Let's find out a little more about that. All right, here we go. The Battle of Widow McCormick's Cabbage Patch. This is from a website called Your Irish Culture. So let's find out what happened here. 6,000 men from Wexford, Kilkenny, and Tipperary. But it doesn't look like anything actually happened. When they reached the small town of Ballingarry on Saturday, July 30th, they came in contact with a force of constables who took refuge in the cabin of a lady known as the Widow McCormick and her 4 children. O'Brien and McManus secured the release of the family and demanded that the constables hand over their arms. When this was refused, the rebels started to stone the cottage. The constables replied by firing 2 volleys of shots, killing 1 man and wounding another. Dejected, the would-be revolutionaries fled from the scene. Oh, wow. O'Brien was later apprehended at the Thurles railway station and tried for high treason. He was found guilty and sentenced to be drawn, hanged, disemboweled, and quartered, although the jury made a strong plea for mercy. Parliament then passed an act which, instead of death, saw O'Brien transported to Tasmania for life. So transportation, we talked about that before, a common punishment. Send him to Australia, in this case Tasmania, because Australia is starting to kind of civilize by this point. So Tasmania is that little island on the southeastern tip of Australia. Interesting. That makes me curious now, and I know we're going on all kinds of rabbit trails today, and I apologize for that, but I hope you don't mind. Now I'm kind of curious, who was the last person to be hanged, drawn, and quartered? Let's find out. All right, the unfortunate soul was David Tyree in 1782. A crowd of 100,000 people watched a Scotsman who was clerking at a Portsmouth naval office who was caught in a treacherous correspondence with the French. He lacked political pull of his own and either the means or inclination to shop Confederates, and therefore faced the full weight of the treason statute. My goodness. So that's like right at the end of the American Revolutionary War. Dang, I didn't realize it was going on that long.
Because its leaders failed to grasp a basic concept. Ireland was too enfeebled by famine and disease to rise, too devoid of hope. And in autumn of 1848, blight returned. It wasn't until the end of 1849 that Ireland saw a healthy harvest. But by that time, at least 1 million people were dead.
And up to 2 million immigrated. The Great Famine proved a landmark in the history.
Put that in perspective. Imagine if in the United States, which I think we have a population of like 330 million, imagine if, I don't know, 150 million people either died or left. What that would do to this country. I mean, you'd have empty homes everywhere. You'd have lots of land not being farmed. You'd have a tremendous hit to the workforce. It would be brutal. And like we talked about previously, Ireland is just now almost back to the population that it had when all of this took place, 170 years later.
History of Ireland. One of the most famous mass migrations in history, it spread the Irish people and their culture across the globe. Escapees from the Young Ireland Rebellion would flee to the United States and form the Fenian Brotherhood, a revolutionary organization that would carry Irish republicanism back to the homeland. The famine itself permanently marred relations with Great Britain, ensuring that moderates like Daniel O'Connell would never get the same kind of traction. Future revolutionaries called on the memory of Black 47, and it might even be argued that the famine set the island, inexorably, on the path to the Easter Rising. The Ireland that Whigs like Secretary Trevelyan wanted to create, one given over to larger-scale farming, never permanently came to pass. In fact, the failure of Russell's free trade policies proved so total, the Whigs lost power in 1852 and dissolved 7 years later. Ireland, at least, did break its reliance on the potato. 1 million people had died due to prejudiced men writing bad policy. A stark warning of what happens when poor relief becomes a tool for political ideology. Trevelyan, for his part, went on to reform the civil service and serve in India. And in 1848, as Irish women and children died homeless along the road, the Queen knighted Trevelyan for his service to the government.
Jeez.
They would later grant him a baronetcy.
Nothing like getting rewarded for being a horrible human being and letting a lot of people die.
Sorry, folks. Sometimes bad men die in their sleep. But there's another legacy of the famine, because the Irish remember when they weren't the ones
Far away and forgotten. Their suffering no more than a line in a newspaper.
today. The Republic of Ireland is a world leader in international food and development aid. In 2018, it provided assistance to over 130 countries, with 80% of its relief efforts going to sub-Saharan Africa.
That's awesome.
And in 2019, they will spend 817 million euros helping the world's poorest.
That's a lot
in
for a small
world where
country.
1 in 8 people are malnourished. Ireland has turned its deepest psychological scar into a call to action. And if after hearing this tale you'd like to help them, check out the links in the description below and see how you can.
That's awesome. Very cool, Ireland. I know we have some folks in Ireland that watch this channel, so good for you guys. That's fantastic stuff. I hope you guys have enjoyed this and hope you don't mind all the rabbit trails I went on today. But let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. What did you learn? Maybe not only today, but throughout the last couple of episodes. Let me know in the comment section. Hit that like button if you would, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.